Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host, Joey Ayoub, and today we'll be talking to Ely Dagher. He is the director of the Palme D'Or-winning Waves 98, which is a short film that came out in 2015, and it is genuinely one of my favorite short films. This might be a bit of an unusual episode just because I'm actually asking you to, or at least I'm recommending watching Waves 98 before listening to this episode. You will find it on Vimeo or in the description of this podcast basically, or on the website, on the Fire These Times website. It's only 15 minutes long and I just highly recommend it. That being said, you don't have to find this conversation interesting. It's just kind of like an added thing that I would recommend, let's put it that way. So I've had a relationship in some ways with this movie for some time now, and I've actually interviewed Ely like 3 years ago for my PhD, and we've been in touch on and off ever since. And yet as the years pass by, this film continues to be more and more relevant, and I think when you do watch it, you'll see why. I actually think that this is one of those movies that will impact audiences in different ways. So if you've experienced Lebanon, it might impact you in one way, but if you haven't, it will still impact you in a different way, I think. So we, of course, spoke about Waves 98. We tried not to kind of have any kind of spoilers, but we just spoke about the general themes. We spoke about the image of the city. We spoke about the context in which the movie was released, namely the 2015 uprising, which in many ways was a precursor to the 2019 revolution. We spoke about this feeling of history repeating itself, something that I myself in my own work call cyclical hauntings. We discussed intergenerational anxiety as a dominant theme in the film. And then we sort of came back to reality in some ways and spoke about Lebanon today, like the post-blast context on resilience and why it's a sort of failed notion. We discussed the ghostly figure in Waves 98, again without spoilers, but just what does that mean? What does a ghostly figure represent in the Lebanese context? And my interpretation of it being sort of like a haunting from the future rather than hauntings being usually from the past. I mentioned a bit some interesting comparisons between Lebanon and Hong Kong, although I didn't get into this in detail just because this was a topic of previous episodes. And so yeah, there's a bit more. I don't know if I'll say everything now. You'll just listen to it if you don't mind. One more thing. We sort of discussed the notion that Beirut is both stuck in the present while at the same time having an uneasy relationship with the past and the future. And so there's a number of academic terms that I use, but I'm trying to make sure to, make it humanly understandable. And we ended up on a positive-ish note, namely discussing if there is a way out of this feeling, this cyclical haunting. I won't say that we have found a answer, but it's something worth asking, I think. Alright, I'll shut up now. If you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate anything, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family or leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. The music is by Torabit. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Ely Dagher. I'm the director of Waves 98. We're going to discuss this today, and it came out in 2015. And I recently just completed my feature film here in Beirut called See Ahead.
Rather unusually, I've asked listeners to watch the movie Waves 98 before listening to this, but assuming they're anything like I was in school and haven't just ignored this homework. Can we start with just some background into Waves 98? Kind of like a surface level description without too many spoilers, but what is it about, and more importantly, how did it come about?
It's a tough question actually, because I think it came about in 2011 or 12, when it was the beginning of the war in Syria, and I was going back and forth between Europe and Beirut at the time. And I remember this one time where I was here, and the situation was quite tense, and there were checkpoints everywhere and everything. But then, everybody was going by their own business as usual. And for some reason, for the first time, I guess because it was so visible everywhere, the tension, I couldn't really connect with that world or with that bubble and sort of pretend that everything was fine. It just came from there, actually. Like, I just had this image of the city, and I wanted to sort of explore my relationship with the city and with living in it, if it was sort of and how did I feel towards, let's say, the social bubble that we create to protect ourselves from the outside world.
I first watched the film shortly after it came out. I think in 2015 or 2016 is when I watched it. As it happened, it was soon after the waste crisis that led to what's now called like the You Stink movement. So the 2015 waste crisis that summer, for those who don't know, Beirut and Mount Lebanon basically suffered from a pretty bad waste crisis. And that led to a protest movement that's called You Stink. You Stink being obviously a reference to the waste, but also a metaphor for the political class, essentially. طلعت ريحتكم in Arabic. So this is why Waves 98 was rather special to me. I was like reflecting, it was early 2016 then. I was reflecting on this summer of protests, and I had cinema studies in like my future, which is what I'm currently doing. And here comes a short film that dealt with our generation's anxieties with a waste crisis that is featured in the movie. But I remember asking you a few years ago when we first started chatting about this, and you said that mentioning a waste crisis was actually rather coincidental. That Waves 98 was already done by the time 2015. By the time the 2015 You Stink movement happened. So can you kind of give a bit of background into the timing of it all?
Yeah, actually, the film came out. I mean, the protest started in summer, and I think it happened after the closure of the landfills, which was in July.
Yeah.
But the film premiered in Cannes in May, and had already finished production like early in the year, I think January, February. And those clips actually I had picked, I think, in 2013. So it was completely coincidental that happened again. And I had a similar experience in the sense that I had sort of forgotten about, like through the process of going to festivals and stuff, about what the footage was about. And then it just hit me one day when the process has just started, and I was watching the film at a festival, and it just felt like the loop was closing in again.
I mean, this might be one of those things that a non-Lebanese audience misses. But the waste crisis mentioned in Waves 98 is actually a different one. I mean, as you said, the movie came out before 2015. It's just easy to forget, especially if you're watching it during the protests or maybe after the summer of 2015. The waste crisis mentioned in Waves 98 is actually the 1998 one. And that waste crisis, in many ways, for those who kind of know the politics of it all, was the one that led to the 2015 waste crisis, because in 1998 they had to build this landfill, and then the closure of that landfill was what led to the 2015 crisis, and therefore the protests that came after it. So the coincidence here is quite extraordinary. But you had your specific reasoning for choosing the 1998 waste crisis. What was it?
Yeah, well, when I was in 2013, actually, I was watching a lot of news rushes from different stations. I was trying to do some research about what was going on that year, and I was trying to find sort of some kind of issue, crisis that sort of everybody would be affected by, because we all know sort of that news in Lebanon is often polarizing and very politicized.
Yeah.
So it's like the news clips would always be taken from some kind of political angle, and I wanted to find something that sort of would go beyond political or sectarian divide, that would speak to all Lebanese audiences that would watch the film and would relate to it. So I had to find like that element from that real world that would express this mess that we have to put up with, to put in the film, and that's where the crisis came in. It could have been something else, but for some reason at the time, that's what felt right. And strangely enough, when the whole crisis blew up in 2015, after the film's release, it was like a weird, thing where reality kind of catches on with fiction. But at the same time, when I did the film, I didn't know there was going to be sort of this, like the sense of maybe possible hope or change that could come out of it. So in that sense, actually, sort of with how how I treated the film, and the disillusionment or the anxiety, and then where that took us in 2015 was a totally different place. But at the same time, I don't know what happened afterwards, so it doesn't always last so long. And so I don't know, like it doesn't refer necessarily to the 2015 crisis per se, but I feel like from the intention of getting something that was sort of that crossed the boundaries of political and sectarian divides is something that actually unified people. And I think it can happen again, and I mean, it might happen this year again. I think the trash, if they stop collecting trash, and it might happen again in the future, just like any other catastrophe, unfortunately, that we've been going through.
Yeah, and I mean, I've told you this before, so I'm not just being a nice host, but Waves '98 is generally one of my favorite films that came out of Lebanon. And I mean, I'm probably annoying listeners here by reminding everyone that that's what I'm currently doing as my PhD. So, I mean, I'm not going to claim any expertise, but I would say that I know what I'm talking about at this point. And one of the insights that I got out of this film is this intergenerational anxiety, or this, haunting, we might even say, that we see Omar, the main character in the film, experiencing. He repeats this sentence that is now just stuck in my mind, in English, I don't want to end up like them. That's what he keeps on repeating a number of times. In your view, I will say as well that we had a written conversation back in 2018 when I was first looking into the movie while writing the PhD. And that interview is still up on well, now it's a newsletter, but it used to be a blog, Hummus for Thought, and I will link that in the show notes. So my question to you is more, why is, like in your view, why is Omar so worried about quote ending up like them?
Yeah, well, I think the ending up like them sort of comes from many different places, and I think in the context of how Omar says it, it's about somehow giving up to the disillusionment, ending numb. And I think when you abandon sort of all sense of hope, that's also how you can live in denial. So I think there's this need to sort of express this anxiety as well, versus just pretending that it's not there. And that's something that I personally have been aware of for a very long time, because that affected me and lots of people around me. And I know that a lot of times it has also stopped me creatively and sort of in many decisions in my life. And sort of thinking about it and expressing it in the film was my way with dealing with it. It was at the time a bit therapeutic. And I think also like with lots of people that saw the film, I had similar conversations, but even with my parents, like my dad told me, the first thing he said when he came out of the screening, he said, like, you're right. And he had like sort of like a proud look. And I was worried that he would feel offended by the film. So I think in a way, like everybody knows this feeling, but some of us tend to sort of suppress it and ignore it and pretend it's not there. But I feel like over the last couple of years, sort of denying that has become much more difficult, especially after the last year and the explosion. I feel like everybody feels this way, and everybody's sort of aware of it, and there's a certain kind of I don't know, acknowledgement of the current situation, which I never felt before.
Yeah, I mean, 2019 is, I think, the year where, especially after the explosion, as you said, after August, 2020, sorry, is the year when, especially after the explosion in August, like this concept of resilience, which we have been, or at least many people in Lebanon would use as a sort of like a factor of, or like an example of how tough the Lebanese people are, or yeah, resilience, essentially. I'm just repeating myself, but that's when for me, I mean, it's been dying for a long time, to be honest. I have this, I participated in this 2013 campaign after one of the explosions, and I think at the time it was one of those in Ashrafiyeh, and the campaign was "We Are Not Martyrs," because well, the usual narrative came out and describing the victims of that explosion as martyrs, but the notion of a martyr is that you're dying for some kind of cause. And obviously no one could really figure out what kind of cause that they die for. For one, they didn't really choose.
They were victims.
They were victims, exactly. And of course, we saw this in 2020. We saw, like, the politicians came out with the usual narrative. And if I'm not mistaken, even the president and some of the others were saying things like, these are martyrs. And they died in the explosion and therefore they're martyrs, and it's a way of avoiding responsibility as well. So
Of
anyway,
course.
this notion of this narrative of resilience, I would also say,
It's
sorry, like
bullshit.
it is
It's
complete
bullshit.
bullshit. And I
Yeah.
have this essay called Resilience, like 2 points broken. So just
Hmm.
linking up the two and arguing that when the main story that came out of that led to this essay, and I've mentioned this before already on this podcast, but there was a number of stories. I had personally heard of them. Sorry, I had personally heard two people tell me the same thing. One on Twitter and one just messaged me privately.
Mm.
Um, that like within the hour after the explosion, their fathers, two different people, were already rebuilding parts of the house. And for me, this was no longer good. Like it was no longer good enough to call this resilience. I think something's deeply broken in us if this is the immediate reaction, because
Yeah.
it doesn't give time for anger, for actually absorbing the shock of what had happened. But as you said, I mean, that was probably that line that was crossed. It was just too much. It's not possible to pretend anymore in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, I know somebody who wanted to fix his apartment also immediately after the explosion, and I was not getting it because it took me 3 weeks before I came back to my apartment. I was,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't get this thing. Like, okay, it's like it so didn't seem urgent at all to sort of go back to rebuilding anything, and I think a lot of people around me felt like that. Like there was, I don't know, the shock, I think, of the explosion and whatever came after it was too big to ignore, I think. So even though some people try to sort of push this concept of resilience, I think much more people than ever kind of, I don't know, accepted it.
Yeah,
And
for
again,
sure.
like it's we're starting from where very few people see it to a place where it's getting a bit better in that sense. Like there's a bit of more awareness on that level, but I wouldn't say it's like everybody feels like that, of course.
No, I mean it's always difficult to say if it's ever a majority. I think
Yeah,
the for me, like in terms of in terms of sociology, I think there is generally an understanding that what you need is a percentage of the population, but it has to be a consistent one. It doesn't necessarily have to be everyone or even a
yeah,
majority. But yeah, I definitely agree that that initial myth, if you want, the myth of Beirut rebuilding itself a billion times and whatever. I think at this point, for in the same reason that the 2013 explosion led to many people, including myself, like declaring we are not martyrs.
yeah,
Um, 2020, especially of course that it came after the 2019 uprising, was that other thing like, oh no, we're really not martyrs and we're not even resilient. We're actually
mm,
just, this is just fucked. This is just not good. We're just victims if we died or even if we didn't die.
yeah. It's just survival mode beyond anything else.
Yeah. And that creates a different kind of implications, because if we're martyrs, not to repeat myself too much, but like if we're martyrs and we did it for a cause, and in some ways, at least many people would therefore justify it. But if we're not martyrs, then we have been killed. If we're victims of something, then there is our perpetrators, and that's the entire point of them not wanting to use those terms and wanting to prefer
Of course.
martyrs instead.
I mean, the
So
whole narrative for the explosion started off being like it was a welding accident and then some other
yeah,
random accident. And I mean, it's clear that nobody wanted to take responsibility on this. And I think playing the martyr card is just one part of it.
yeah, for sure. Um, just to go back a bit to Waves 98.
Yeah.
The well, I mean, honestly, it's very difficult for me to talk about just a movie without talking about its context. And as it happens, the context that it has even followed Waves 98 is so overwhelming. It's difficult not to bring it up as well. Um, but I will just sort of say that if from in our 2018 conversation, the one that I will link, I mentioned the ghostly figure, which is which is who is or which is in Waves 98, and a ghostly figure in general has kind of become a rather relatively common, or at least in many Lebanese films after 1990 have brought up sort of a ghostly figure. Um, in some films it's a literal vampire, in other films it's just a haunting, a different format, whether an actual ghost or some kind of spirit, or even like a real person, but a person who, for example, in Rassan Salahab's film, it's a person who was supposed to be dead but isn't dead, or in A Perfect Day, which is another film. It's more about the father being. They don't know if the father died or not because he's one of the forcibly disappeared, but they have to make the decision as to whether to declare him dead or not. And so there is that haunting that comes out throughout that film, which I also recommend. But what I found unique in Waves 98, and on a different level, Submarine, which is another short film by Munya Ael, I'll talk about this in a bit, um, is that you in Waves 98, you had this haunting from the future. So it was the fear of being stuck essentially in perpetuity, like in the present. If I want to be fancy about it, I would call it like permanent liminality. That's what I'm using in my PhD. But essentially, it just means a extended present, like we're just stuck in the future. We're stuck in the present because the future keeps on repeating itself, or the past keeps on repeating itself, and therefore it's the future. Basically, that this fear of, I don't want to end up like them, is what created the ghost. And I remember reflecting on that a lot, and it's still to this day something that I use. Just even that sentence, I don't want to end up like them, has just become this thing that I think about a lot. I remember soon after the explosion, even I thought about this, and it's something that we're in 2019. During the uprising of 2019 in October, I had a few months later, early 2000, basically when I started this podcast last year, Lina Munzer, who's a Lebanese writer who I've had a couple of times now. And I've had her twice, once after the uprising, or like shortly after the uprising, and one after the blast, one after the explosion. And the first time around, we spoke a lot about like life in the midst of history, because we really felt that for however it would end, that October 2019 was really something that was objectively unique. But we spoke also about it in terms of like our own experience, like what we felt experiencing it. And then, of course, fast forward to the episode after the explosion. It was August 7th or 8th, just a few days after. Um, it was really about how we were broken, and it's a pretty. I haven't listened to it again because it's a rather difficult. It was a rather difficult one to do, but that's what really came out of it. That this is something that really changed things, but on the other side of the coin, essentially. Like if October 2018 changed things for the better, well, August 2020 changed things for the worse, obviously. And this is what, I don't know if I'm making sense, but this is what kind of I thought about when I more recently, while even preparing this chat with you, I was thinking about when I watched Waves 98 again. And the thing is, one thing I think I haven't mentioned to you yet, because it's an upcoming project, but I will mention it here. I'm in conversation with a number of activists and like artists and whatever from Hong Kong. And I mean, I think the uprising in Hong Kong happened more or less at the same time as the uprising in Lebanon. It was a few months before. And Hong Kong is very much it's a small place. I mean, it's technically a city, but it's a small place like Lebanon, smaller, I think. And it also has this problem, to put it very mildly, with its past. And especially now with the increasing authoritarianism with its future, meaning that its future is being taken away from it. And so we had this exchange, myself and a Hong Kong activist, who's actually the very first guest that came on this podcast. So people can just go to the first one. And we spoke a lot about this notion of disappearances and this notion of hauntings from the past and hauntings from the future. So Waves 98, I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that Waves 98 has even found some resonance outside of Lebanon. And I think it's fair to say that, especially with the experience of the pandemic, the global COVID-19 pandemic since 2020, many more people might feel, at least, if not the specific hauntings of Lebanon, maybe some kind of unease anyway, and might find some resonance in watching it. I don't know if, like, from your side, it's been 5 years now, 6 years almost. since it came out. Well, 6 years exactly since it came out in Cannes, I think. Didn't you say it was early
It
2015?
was in it was in May, but I finished. I think I finished production in February.
Yeah.
So
Well,
almost
close enough.
Yeah.
How have you been? I mean, if you've been rewatching it, or if other people have watched it recently, are there sort of like just, I don't know, interesting reflections that you would like to share about this in terms of the past 6 years with relation to the film?
Yeah. Um, I mean, speaking of reaction, actually, I had a talk, I had a class with some students from the architecture department at AUB, and they had like a really interesting analysis of the film. And strangely enough, it was this was actually, I think, two months ago, not more, and it was interesting to see how it spoke a lot to them about the current situation of the country. And I think like towards the end of the conversation, they were all talking about how, well, besides the fact how they identified with how they feel today, but also with the question of like, can they stay here? Should they leave? Complete lost in their future. And it was kind of a depressing conversation, honestly, towards the end. But it was kind of it was interesting to see how like the film, which came out basically 6 years ago, still speaks to the present today. Like when I did the film back then, like it was a very different time before 2015. I mean, there were some protests that started in 2011 and then 2013, and but it wasn't at all, you know, the level that we're at today. And but for some reason, I always remember. And so I grew up in the 80s, so I do remember a bit of the war, but then mainly my childhood was sort of the post-war recovery, as they call it, which, you know, got us where we are today. So I saw this like great time where everybody's making money and everybody's happy that we're building the city or building the country, and then it just slowly started collapsing slowly after that. So and I feel like the 2015 protest was maybe one of the first ones that I remember that was sort of that big, like as a counter movement to, to the state of affairs. And I don't know, it felt like it gave people a lot of hope. And soon after that, you know how sort of it was crushed. Like we were khawano, kif khawano. They it's a difficult one to translate. You know, they had all these rumors and conspiracies about who's paying for the protesters and who's behind this, and they completely managed to sort of suppress the movement.
They crushed it in many ways, yeah.
Yeah. So then we went back to sort of the state that I felt before 2015, but somehow it was even stronger. And actually, like I started writing my feature film, so in a way, I cannot separate the last 6 years of sort of going through the process of rewatching Waves with what's happening in the country without actually considering also my last film, my feature, because I started writing actually towards the end of 2015 when the movement was getting crushed again. And I felt like I had sort of much more to sort of explore and express and understand myself also about this whole situation, about the anxiety, about the sort of like feeling of stuckness and how do you deal with it. And also there was a lot of my friends that sort of, for some reason, that was the year where they were fed up with living here. They felt that their health was in danger, their kids' health was in danger, and a lot of people started leaving again in 2015. And like in my personal case, for example, a lot of people from my family had left in the 90s. And unfortunately, a lot of them had to come back, and they came back sort of more broken than they had left, with sometimes a passport, sometimes not even that, and having lost basically everything they had built for years before that. And so I wanted to somehow explore what that meant, sort of this idea of like wanting to leave, but then what does that mean exactly? And then the return to basically where Lebanon is today. And so like a lot of the themes that are in Waves and sort of in terms of temporality and this idea of dealing with an unresolved past, a very moving present that's unpredictable, and even more unpredictable and menacing future, which somehow are in waves. I developed them even more in the film, and then basically similar but even more complex than what happened with Waves was that we only started pre-production I think in November 2019. So as at the beginning of the protest movement and the whole revolution. And there was a huge sense of euphoria in the city. We were walking everywhere, protesting, blocking roads, blocking parliament, and there was this huge sense of solidarity, and you saw people from all walks of life and all different cities, and for a brief moment, I questioned whatever it was that I was working on, because I felt like I actually believed that change can happen, and that we're sort of at the break of something, like as you had said before, sort of almost historic, and that this was it. And the closer we got to the shoot, the more that started disappearing. I'm not sure when Hassan Diab's government came in, but I think it was around that time when things started to
2020 or so,
yeah, exactly. And we shot basically end of January 2020. So we were shooting and we were going back into the States, again, even deeper depression, deeper disillusionment, and sort of feeling of hopelessness. And everybody on set felt that as well. And we were making a film somehow about this feeling. And yeah, I don't know, it was a bit tough, but we had a really great cast. We had really great crews. We kind of pulled it together. And I wouldn't say, it's not a resilient thing. It's just we had to do what we had to do. And I felt that, also living that through those times was important.
What can you tell us about the film, actually, the new one?
Yeah, well, basically, it's the story of a young woman, a 26-year-old, who had left Beirut to study in Paris at the age of 21. And for reasons we don't necessarily know, she got to a point where she had no choice but to come back to Beirut. And the film actually starts at her return in Beirut. It's all set in Beirut. And it sort of chronicles her return as she tries to, I wouldn't say fit in, but just kind of almost lay low, as she just sort of escaped something and she is in this broken state. But she comes back to a country that, well, is not contemporary of 2020, but of, let's say, early 2019, which is different, but also not that different to where we are. And yeah, there's this general sense of, I guess, limbo or numbness. And she sort of, through the redemption of her family, she starts reconnecting with her past lover, and sort of the life that she had in Beirut and the life that could have been had she stayed. So it's really about sort of coming to terms with the past and what were the reasons behind her departure and why she left Beirut in the first place. And there's this permanent looming fear of, I guess, the catastrophe. For some reason, that's something that I always felt, and that time felt stronger than ever when I was writing the film. So it's really about this idea of how do you live day to day, or how do you even move forward with your life while always being in the state of anxiety about what might happen and what's going to happen. So it's really about sort of these two normally dissonant relationships between hope and despair. But I feel like they do coexist in all of us, not only here living in Beirut, but I think everywhere. And I think also something that I felt towards the end of the production on Waves 98, and which I think is where the last scene comes from, is somehow this understanding that they somehow can coexist, and it's okay that they coexist. I think being completely hopeful isn't necessarily something very useful in Lebanon, and being completely in despair isn't either. I think there's this middle ground where we need to find I don't know, some terms of acceptance. It's always going to be this happy Hollywood ending where everything's going to turn out right, but that shouldn't either stop us from at least trying to change things. I guess that's my personal my personal take on things.
Yeah.
Like I'm not the most optimistic person, but I'm not defeatist and despaired either. So it's a weird place to be, but I think we have to sort of embrace that if we want to move forward.
I don't know if you know of the term pessimist.
Piss optimist? No, what's that?
Pessimist, optimist, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bit of that. It's like preparing for the worst in some ways while trying to work for the best, that kind of mentality. But I mean, it's a very difficult one to maintain, obviously.
Of course.
I mean, you're based you're in Beirut, as you said, and Beirut itself in Waves 98 is portrayed in a certain way, which for me is, I mean, it's technically portrayed in a fictitious way, but for me felt very, very accurate. And you told me back in that early chat in 2018 that, and I'm quoting here, by the way. So let me quote. Early on, I knew that my main character was as much Beirut as Omar, and it was important to portray Beirut in its textures and colors while also being impressionistic. It's about how it feels more than the way it looks in quote-unquote reality, which is why I still work the real photos and footage. The characters I wanted to remain abstract and neutral, which is why they are animated in a simple way with basic character design and outfits. They are meant to represent a broader group of people than the individuals that they are, end quote. So can we kind of just talk a bit about Omar's Beirut and how, I don't know, how has Omar's Beirut changed since Waves 98 came out? I don't know, maybe the Beirut in Waves 98, which is older than our Beirut, but I mean, I guess especially in the past few years in comparison.
Yeah. Well, I guess like Omar's Beirut, let's say the end of the 90s Beirut, for me, that's sort of whatever the whole, let's say, magical journey in the film represents. It was a time where, like, I personally sort of ventured into the city because I grew up like in Zella. I don't know where that is, like a few kilometers a bit outside of the city.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was sort of the time that I ventured into the city and I made new friends and I explored things, and somehow it was it had a very idyllic feeling, I guess, because we were young as well and sort of a bit careless.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think sort of that Beirut is mixed with the Beirut that sort of came around it and a bit after that, which was sort of the chaotic Beirut, the Beirut that was sort of completely, cemented everywhere. Like I grew up in a farmhouse, actually, like really close to we had a garden and it was an old farmhouse, and we lost it in 2004. So I think also gentrification per se, and sort of like they built a huge tower instead,
Right.
was something that I personally felt very angry about for a long time. And I think that's where that aspect of the city comes from, because I grew up also really close to the sea, but then by bit we sort of started not seeing the sea, and I think that's also why when they go to that magical world, the sea is the first place they go to. So I think it comes from like this idea that I grew up in a time where I felt, already we had like little access to public spaces and beaches and things. Everything was polluted, only got worse around that time. And I think I wanted to sort of explore that contrast between, what we would ideally want it to be versus how it actually felt, like completely overgrown cement jungle that was quite suffocating. And so how has it changed since then? I mean, the last couple of years are very specific because, like I would say, before 2019, it was more of the same. But like with the whole COVID crisis, economic crisis, well, right now the city feels more like a ghost town. Because I live in in Ashrafi, and so a lot of houses are destroyed since the explosion, and the streets are empty, and there's power cut all the time. So it seems like a more extreme version of whatever it was, I guess, that Thomas Big was in 98. Just more the same, but worse.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Ain Saadi, which is in Mount Lebanon, just next to Beit Mere. And for me, Beirut was actually always concrete because I grew up surrounded by a bit more trees than are in Beirut.
Yeah.
But it became well, the fact it became my home when I started AUB and stuff, so in 2010, 11, 12, 13. And I didn't see that much of the gentrification just because by the time I moved there, most of it had already happened. But of course, that continued.
Mm.
And I mentioned this story a number of times of the when I was involved in the Save Beirut Heritage campaigns um, in the early
Mm.
2010s, basically. And it was all about trying to prevent or even mitigate gentrification as much as possible, especially when it came to those like very nice and pretty old looking buildings and that sort of thing. Um,
Yeah.
but that's what it was for me in some ways. So when I watched Waves 98
But
and
funny, actually. Yeah,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, tell me.
No, I was just saying it's funny that you say that you grew up in Ain Saadi because I went to I went to school in Ain Saadi. I was at Mona Sal, and do you know what that is?
Yeah, I did a year in
Yeah,
Monas. I did a year in
yeah.
Monasan.
So basically, like the view that Omar has over the city from his school comes from the view that we had from Mona Sal over Beirut in a way. Because
Okay,
I used to sort
this
of
makes a
sit
lot
and
of
watch.
sense.
Yeah, yeah. So like I used to sit there and watch the city for a very long time. But then yeah, sort of let's say again, I want to go back to the magical aspect because now you know sort of where I went to school. You can see sort of how I was a bit outside of Beirut at Hamra and stuff. But I I made a lot of friends like when I was 16 from Hamra and Beirut, and there were sort of areas that growing up with like how it was segregated back then, we didn't really go to these places. Downtown was still sort of off limits until like end of the 90s.
Yeah.
Um, so so it was like a whole part of the city that I didn't know that I started exploring sort of even when I was in school. So I guess maybe that's why like I felt more connected to these things because I was living there more, like between my parents' house, which, as I told you, lost in 2004, and I was I think like 19 or 20 at the time. So I was quite an adult, and we had I think 1 week to leave the house and find something else. So it was quite traumatic, and yeah, like the whole neighborhood changed completely since then. And I think that's something that has marked me for a long time. And like now, for example, my feature film. I mean, I haven't said this before, but that's fine. But we basically shot it in my parents' apartment, which is where
Mm.
they live now, and it's in one of the towers, basically outside of Beirut, that sort of overlooks, quote unquote, the sea, but not really. Um, so somehow that element sort of still made it into like I'm obsessed about, but or haunted by this. I don't know,
Yeah.
by the city's presence. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I grew up being able to see the sea, but always with, that layer of pollution that you see on top of it.
Yeah.
That always sort
Yes.
of colored, well, literally colored it from
Mm.
from the distance. Unfortunately, it really does change the
Colored
way.
it brown.
Yeah, basically colored it
Yeah.
brown. Um, but that's why I always felt very alienated by the sea and by the coasts. And whenever I would, like my partner's from a coastal town in Italy,
Mm.
when we would go to visit her folks or whatever, I would feel very like I'm in a strange land, like this is an alien land. And whenever I would go to the mountains, it's like, oh, okay, this is more familiar now.
Mm.
It's just one of those things, I guess. But like, I mean, you mentioned hauntings, and of course that is the main theme that I'm getting out of it. That is the main theme that I'm well exploring in one of my chapters in this PhD.
Mm.
This cyclical haunting, as we said, like things repeating themselves. I don't want to end up like them, etc., etc. And one of the ways you show that, or at least you use television to let's say install the mood
Mm.
that either precedes or it was just after he says I don't want to end up like them. If I remember correctly, there's like a television scene, and then he says that.
Yeah.
Um, for me, television sorry, for me television has also had this quality to it, and that's why, like, here in this apartment there's no television. And I've actually gotten rid of televisions whenever I would move to a new place and stuff. I
Mm.
don't have one at home. And I think part of it, I mean, I don't like them, but part of it is just that quality that for me growing up, television, it was the evening news, and the evening news tended to be, for the most part, bad shit happening. Like there was almost never any kind of, today and there's something good happening. It wasn't, it wasn't part of the landscape essentially growing up, or the
Yeah.
mediascape, I would say. But the television present in Waves 98 is, I don't know, maybe a curious detail for a non-Lebanese audience. I'm actually not sure if you've seen different reactions, or maybe not. I don't know. But
Mm.
in terms of the televisions themselves, this, or at least like the haunting quality of watching television in Lebanon, from your standpoint, can you sort of explain it?
Of course. Actually, there's a small detail that I just remembered, but back in the time when I was working on the film, like on Waves, and I started writing and like drawing and everything. I remember it was basically when the Arab Spring started and the revolution in Egypt, and then
Mm-hmm.
sort of around the region. And I was actually glued. I had the TV on the whole time because I felt like there was something so like big happening, and somehow that was how I felt like I was close to it. But then at the same time, it was like lots of bad shit happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, just like a side note, I had I think the TV on for years around that period because of that. But in the film, the TV is really sort of the connection to the outside world, to the real world, versus the I guess also the animated world. And yeah, it is a sort of constant reminder that things are not really going well. And it comes from a personal place, I guess, because sort of living here, sometimes you're just going about your day, you're doing things, getting things done, and then somebody in the house, or you hear some news somewhere, and you turn on the TV, and something bad has happened, someone's been assassinated, or there's casualties, and then everything just stops, and we just sit there in front of the TV, follow the news, and somehow numbed, don't really react. It's just you know just absorbing and watching and experiencing this terrible thing, but just through the TV. Um, and we just like spend days usually, I don't know, from the couch to
Yeah.
the kitchen with the TV. It's always on in the background, discussing what had happened. And then slowly that sort of kind of goes away. But then, at least for me, I feel like there's always this fear, like that it's going to happen again soon. And that's what I said, like, I mean, besides the fact that it's on TV, that was something that I personally struggled with a lot, actually, sort of also creatively, because sort of whenever something like that would happen, I would feel like, okay, whatever project I'm working on is actually, worthless now, because there's something much worse or grander happening outside.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's always this thing of like, how do you, you know, how do you continue when there's a constant reminder of that, and then you feel like there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe you can, I don't know, but at least that was the general feeling usually when these things happened. And in the film, actually, there's the TV in the beginning, where the father's like asleep in front of the TV, and then he says, "I don't want to end up like them." But there's also another very brief one shot of the TV towards the end of the magical scene,
Yeah.
just before everything starts to crumble again. And yeah, I mean, even for me, and I say this like without any pretension, but like for a while watching the film after it came out and I had worked on it, like when that scene comes, it gives me goosebumps. Like I know that shit's gonna, like, I don't know, there's something. I think like a lot of these things come from a very personal place. I think it's difficult for me to sort of assess how like a foreign audience would get it, but for me, just seeing that footage just after being in this world and the sea and all that sort of magical utopian life, I feel like it just it's like a punch in the face.
Yeah.
But yeah, it might not be the same for everyone, obviously.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there is that Hong Kong person, Hong Kong friend.
Mm.
She should probably be listening to this because I'll ask her to. She reflected on that as well, and I won't say too much on this because there's probably gonna be some project that comes out of some kind of like Lebanon Hong Kong collaboration or whatever. We'll see.
Okay.
But I'm very always I'm fascinated by these other contexts that also have this very difficult, like to put it mildly, like a difficult relationship with the past, essentially. Hong Kong has a lot of these. They would call them disappearances. There are entire books basically discussing that, because they had this. Well, now things are changing so quickly there that almost what I say is a bit irrelevant. But before the events, before the protests, and then the crackdown, and then everything, they had this expiry date, basically, 2047, if I'm not mistaken, like 50 years after the handover, 50 years after 1997. And they had this kind of looming, literally, like they would describe it as an expiry date. And so it kind of, um, it created a whole number of artistic creations, especially movies, but also other stuff and books as well, and whatever, novels and stuff, with this in mind. Like, how do you create a future? How do you think of a future if you know when the future is going to stop or the future is going to end, essentially?
Yeah.
It obviously creates different kind of temporalities, different kind of anxieties even as well. But like for me, that scene, the one in the end, the magical scene as we're calling it, um, I don't know. It was a good contrast. And here I will say, I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but you use both animation and like real life footage, and you kind of blend them
Yeah.
both together at times. Which is probably, I think, I'm not like a movie analyst, but I think this is what creates that effect of like, is this real? Is this not real? You know, this in betweenness, essentially, as you described it before. Um, but that scene, like you mentioned when you were talking about the sea, and if it's okay, I would just ask you to expand a bit, because most people in Lebanon, at least after of a certain age, I would guess like my age and maybe younger, I don't know, but like the experience of the sea is not necessarily very deep, largely because most of the coast is privatized, and obviously pollution in most of the coast as well is pretty bad. And you know, for the most part, although there will be lots of folks who, you know, will swim ashore, or sorry, will swim like far away and maybe discover the depth of the sea or whatever, but I think most people don't do that due to this alienation. And so the contrast here obviously is this magical world where you have these massive creatures and colorful creatures and whatever. So can you just talk a bit about the I guess the creative process behind it all?
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that like I had some people after screenings who sort of thought this was just like some acid trip or some like, you know, some kind of drug trip, and then that was it. Whereas, you know, for me, I had never even considered that. Like, I mean, yeah, they're young, maybe they did take some drugs, but that was not the point. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, as I said before, like sort of, I think for me, growing up sort of on the coast and having the access to the sea blocked, for some reason, I always had like a very special relationship with the sea. Like whenever I would travel somewhere, I would actually go and like watch the sea for a while, the day before I leave. Like there's something I find very freeing or liberating about it, and I think it's mainly because like I grew up on the coast where you're sort of facing the sea on one end, which is not accessible, then behind you is just like walls of buildings and buildings and the mountains. So I think geographically, sort of growing up here, the sea had that feeling of sort of, you know, like somehow of an opening, of an escape. Like I know now, for example, if I go to Field or somewhere like more inland, I feel less comfortable because it feels not very familiar. I feel like I'm far from the sea. Like it's not very. It's a strange thing. It's not like a tangible thing. I don't know how to explain it. It's just something that, you know, I guess it's just how I grew up. And so yeah, I think the element of the sea comes largely from that. And in terms of like the creatures and the experience of the city, I think it was really coming from this feeling that I had when I was younger, and I sort of explored the city, and I grew up and learned so much as I went out of, you know, Zala, and sort of after this like heavily segregated regions that we had in the 90s. And I don't know, it felt like everything was possible. Like I made friends that are still like family to me today. We had big dreams, we were young. And I think like the magical and surreal element of that world and the animals come from sort of that feeling where you feel like everything is possible and you can have sort of the world of your dream somehow. But yeah, I mean, we all know that reality always ends up though seeping in somehow, and
Yeah,
can crush those dreams.
I mean that's the haunting bit. That's
Yeah.
the haunting bit. And so I have this. I don't know if a couple of years ago, I think I wrote this essay for Regard, which is this like film journal published by USG, Université Saint Joseph, in Lebanon. For those who don't know, and I argued in that piece, and I sort of still stand by it, although the events of 2019, 2020 definitely slowed things down. Let's put it that way. But I remember just reflecting on the metaphor of waste and just that as being basically deeply indicative of politics in Lebanon. Because I mean, other than the obvious one that the You Stink movement was both about the crisis, like the crisis was stinking, the waste actually stinking, obviously, but also that being symbolic of the system itself, of politics in Lebanon, of the establishment, etc. Like they are rotting from within.
Yeah.
It kind of took me by surprise once I kind of, you know, gotten into that rabbit hole a bit academically to discover that there's even a book. I have it with me here. It's called "The Politics of Haunting and Memory in International Relations," and the title doesn't really matter. But the same author also wrote an essay called "The Politics of Decay, Death, Mortality, and Security," in which, in both cases, Lebanon is brought up, and especially the 2015 You Stink movement is brought up. Her name is Jessica Octor, I should say.
Okay.
Basically, she saw, or like she clearly saw the links between hauntings and haunting in singular or plural, depending how people feel it, experience it. But the link between hauntings and decay, and before I did, and it actually helped me not feel insane that while I was seeing that link a bit myself. And I had sort of started feeling that the decay is both, because I mean decay is obviously linked to mortality, it's obviously linked to death, it's the as grim as it gets, essentially. And at the same time, two short films, yours and Munia Al's Submarine, which came out I think a year later or something, for me they sort of just represented a potentially different a potential shift, if you want, from the movies that came out before. So the way I've argued it in that essay, and I'll explain why I say that the events have kind of changed that a bit, but that there was a first wave and a second wave of cinema after the end of the Civil War, at least the official end, like after 1990. And the difference between those two is that in the first wave, that was largely by people who really grew up during the war. So not just in your case, you were born in the 80s, but you grew up really in the 90s. In their case, it's they really grew up in the 70s and in the 80s, like our parents, basically, our parents' generation for the most part. And their movies is usually, I don't want to generalize too much, but usually you will have sort of like the war in the background somehow, or it's actually the main story. So it's actually, it's about the disappeared, or, quote unquote, al-Makhtufin. It might be about some event in the war. It might be about the reconstruction. The 90s actually created quite a lot of these hauntings themselves. And so that was so basically hauntings from the past and what is in the process of being erased, essentially. And then, of course, at least that, as far as the argument went in that essay, film like yours and films like Munia, and I was basically guessing or theorizing that more of those similar themes might come up. But I wrote this in 2019, and then other shit came up. So as far as I know, this has been on pause for now. We'll see, I guess. But I don't know. I guess my question here is a bit more abstract. Okay, so we said how Waves 98 came out by coincidence during or like just before the 2015 stuff, the crisis and then the protests, etc. And so I mean, a way of putting it is that the wave of 1998 was reproduced in 2015. And if we can sort
Mm.
of picture that instead of being released in 2015, it was released in 2019 during the October Revolution, uprising, etc. Let's call it Waves 2015. Um,
Mm.
how would a Waves 2015, in your view, kind of maybe look different than Waves 98, or I don't know, maybe look exactly the same?
Um, I think I think just from like from what I said before about like how some like new audience saw the film a couple of months ago and how I feel towards the film when I watch it now and I think about it. I think it wouldn't look necessarily that different. I think the only difference for me would be going further than where Waves 98 ends.
Right.
Um, and I think that's what I tried to do since then. I think we're like, I mean, as you know, we sort of went through these crises, and then there's like movements of like hope and change, then that gets crushed again. Then there's like this cycle that we go always going through. And I feel like today we haven't really managed to break out of that cycle. So I feel like, talking about contemporary Lebanon, contemporary life in Beirut, I don't think it necessarily wouldn't be that different. Um, I don't know if I were to do it today, if I would look back at the 90s specifically, or if I would look back at the 2015, um,
Mm.
because like there was something very specific in Waves, which is sort of like this innocence of youth, I guess, in a way that the character had. Um, and it was personal, so it came from that place, whereas I wouldn't know necessarily what I don't know, a 16 or 17-year-old would feel in 2015 per se.
Right.
Like I don't know how I experienced 2015. I think that's that's very different. I think the contrast maybe wouldn't be the same or it wouldn't speak like that. But just yeah, again, just to go back to what I heard from the students a couple of months ago, they completely identified with the same feeling. So I guess in a way it would be the same. But just to go back to what you mentioned about
Mm-hmm.
like the films that came out since then, I think at least, I mean, I can speak for myself. I think the reason why I choose to speak about the themes that I speak about is because I felt like our lives, sort of like, I guess, yeah, the younger generations than the directors that grew up in the 70s, as much as we're sort of aware and affected by the war, there's also a certain reality that we kind of inherited from the previous generations that we
Yeah.
don't talk about, or
Yeah.
at least we didn't talk about so much. And I felt like, okay, so I get that there's all these things from the past, but besides all the unresolved things from the past, our present is also as chaotic, and our future seems more bleak than ever. Then let's also, have like a uh, more broad understanding of where we are today and how our past feeds into our present and our future, because I don't think we can disconnect one from the other. And I think like also part of it is because like the war never really ended. They just did a ceasefire and changed tactics. So I feel like it's not like there's this sort of this period of mess or shit that we sort of look back on with all these kind of exploration and sort of try to understand and make sense of, without also taking into this consideration where that continued afterwards. Like, so I don't see the war as like its own block of bad stuff. Like, obviously, it was much worse than what came afterwards, but what came afterwards also affects our daily lives, and it's also basically born out of that. And I think it's
Yeah.
important to also discuss contemporary life and what that's like and how we go about it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's even in my own research, to be honest. I mean, the notion of a post-war is very contested,
Mm,
and a more accurate term usually, I mean, in political science, if you want, would be like frozen conflict.
mm,
So it's more that, well, it's frozen, it's not actually gone.
mm,
And you know, if I want to be a bit more philosophical about this, like I do argue in my own thesis that I don't actually call it war and post-war. I mean, when I do, it's in quotation. I describe it more as war and not war. So it's hyphenated. It's all
Yeah.
one concept, and the idea really is that the only thing that defines the periods where you don't have, um, let's say, active conflict, like in 2006, 2008, whatever. Um, the only thing that defines those moments, those years, or those days even, are the fact that there isn't that violence. It's like it's defined by the negative. It's defined by the absence of the violence, and it's the violence that's actually expected to always come back. And you actually have like entire frameworks of there's one book. I forgot the name of the book, but the author is Sami Hermes, and he mentions the anticipation of violence. That's what it's called. And you have other by I'm just like, sorry, I'm dumping all of this, but you have another academic called Joanne Rendanusho, and she describes the temporality of it all as wartime. And the idea is that wartime doesn't end during the war, but it's something that is evoked a number of times in what is called the post-war. So like you can easily think of, to use a concrete example, but during the protest, you had a number of supporters of some of the other political parties, always saying that, well, if you continue this way, we will have a civil war, or let's go back to 2008 when there was a mini civil war, or they would basically use the past as a threat in the present, essentially, is what I'm saying. And this is the concept that's explored. And as long as the past isn't, if not resolved, but at least like made peace with, the argument goes, wartime continues because it's always a source of like, you can always use something that happened in the past to justify a politics in the present. Let's put it this way.
Of course.
I'm
And it's all based out of fear anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all based on fear.
Yeah. The anticipation of violence is that it's the fact that you're anticipating violence. So like you're anticipating sorry, I'm repeating myself. Like you're anticipating violence, and so in the present you're living with the fear of something might happen. Like you don't know that tomorrow there will be violence, but you also don't know that it won't. And that kind of
course,
sense of not knowing is that part of the reason why you have this widespread restlessness in Lebanon.
Yeah,
To this day.
and I feel like the reason why it's so potent and like effective, the strategy, is also because the people know what that is. Like we've lived it time and time again. So it's not like this abstract notion that we might be afraid of, but we know what that's like, and we've seen the countries around us go through things, and it's tough. But at the end of the day, like I think what came out of 2019, which can maybe be a bit of opposition to that, but I think people are more aware that somehow they share like common interests, like basic social needs and basic social rights, and I mean, I feel like we know that the decision to go to war or not is largely also a political one, and it's not the people who were protesting early October Revolution that are gonna like carry guns and shoot each other. So I mean, besides it being just like and this like unknown abstract fear, it's almost like a threat as well. And I think that's a lot to ask from a society that also lived through these things to actually accept that and take it on and be like, fuck it, I don't care.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I sort of want us to end on a positive-ish note. And so I mean, there was going to be usually it's the book section, but in this case, we're going to have a movie section. Before getting into that section, there is a concept that I kind of already brought it up, like cyclical haunting. And Waves 98, of course, expresses this, again, I don't want to end up like them, etc. But something that I really found, as interesting, like equally interesting, is that there's sort of a hint towards the end, like without giving too much away, but there's sort of a hint that there might be a possible way out of that cycle, a way of having rather than the future being just a repetition of the past, a way of sort of having all of these temporalities meet and maybe getting out of it that way. I don't know. I remember you also reflecting on this back when we spoke like a few years ago.
Mm.
Given, I don't know, maybe you will, this question is a repetition, I don't know, but because there is that sense that a way out is possible, or let me ask it this way, I guess. Why did you feel the need to include a potential way out in the movie?
Um, yeah. The thing is, well, it's a way out, but what kind of way out is it? Like, is it a way out that's gonna make everything better? And the
Yeah.
world that he's looking from the viewpoint where he's standing or floating over the sea, is it gonna be better, or is it more of a, I don't know, like it's some personal realization or personal understanding or some kind of strength? Because I feel like what happens throughout the film, or at least with me as I was working on the film, is like um, this notion, as I said before, sort of like the conflict between, I guess, despair and hope. And I guess now I could say, like, I don't see them necessarily as binary, but there's something actually that came out through the process of actually working on the film. Because when I started writing and in production, actually, I think I only had the ending after a year and a half of production. So I had already started animating, I had scenes, because I didn't know how I felt about whatever it was that I was actually exploring. Um, so I didn't know how I stand. Like I knew that I had trouble. Like I always had trouble sort of, going in a bubble completely isolated. I was never that person. But still sort of being in a bubble with everything happening, I was finding difficult. Like I was finding myself sort of judging my friends and, I was really sort of in a conflictual situation in terms of like how I felt about
Right.
like this life that we have in Beirut. And I think through the process of working on the film, I get to a point where that question didn't matter anymore. Um, so I think the end of the film is really this a reflection of that. Because I think a lot of the anxiety comes from feeling like you have to choose between, despair and hope, and you feel like you're stuck in between, and you sort of, it creates this like very heavy sinking feeling where you sort of can't, you know, function basically. Um, and yeah, so I don't know. I feel like sometimes we don't have like I didn't have the privilege to choose one over the other, and so yeah, it's not like a happy ending where he has a way out and his life is going to be better and everybody's life is going to be better. But maybe from where he stands, he sees things, I guess, more clearly, and he finds some kind of like little peace within that. And that's when his future joins his present. And as you saw also, like as you mentioned, the idea of decay and death, like the future is this almost decaying old man that that joins the present. So it's a way out, but uh, I think it's up to I don't say like to interpretation. That's maybe too abstract, but I guess whatever your personal experience and how you experience the film and where you find yourself standing at the end is what's right. And for me, it was the fact that yeah, that question doesn't matter anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, on that note,
Was that a happy note to
I
end
mean,
on?
it is a happy note because it's like it's open to interpretation. So I guess it depends on the mood of the people listening.
Yeah.
um, well, if you don't mind recommending a few things now.
The first thing that comes to mind actually is a book that I've read a couple of times, and for some reason I have around a lot lately. It's called The Agony of Power. I don't know if you've read it. It's a collection of Baudrillard texts. Um, that's basically it was initially unpublished text actually that the editor combined, and it basically talks about his theories before he died, about history repeating itself and about from a state of he calls it what do you call it, domination to a state of total hegemony. And he talks about
Right.
like it's about I guess yeah politics and media and like it says a lot about actually the world that we're in today as well. So I would recommend reading that book. In terms of films, I think the first film that comes to mind is Actually, there's two. There's Persona by Ingmar Bergman. I think I saw this film really long time ago. I was really young, and I think like a lot of films actually that I tend to be drawn to, it's often let's say the non-linear classic narrative and timeline. So the film about this like personal journey of an actress, and the film sort of depicts her with her alter ego somehow. That's played by a nurse. Really bad at pitching films, but basically, yeah, I don't know. There's something in like how the film talks about cinema, about narratives, about like also personal struggle that I find very powerful. And the third film probably be Caché by Michael Haneke. I think it's called Hidden in English. Not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's also one of the films that sort of influenced me when I was younger. And again, actually talks a bit about like media, about recording, about anxiety, sort of, and majorly also about haunting from the past and how that can actually seep into your present and affect it. And Haneke has a way that's like a precise sort of like surgeon way to sort of build his films and edit and work with the sound that I find generally very exciting, to say the least. So yeah, it's really powerful film, and there's a lot to say about it. So I would definitely recommend watching it. I mean, if somebody hasn't watched it yet.
Well, thanks for that. And on sort of that note, and see, this is a positive note. It's one book and two movies. That's a good thing. Well, on that note,
have you read the book or seen the films?
I've seen Persona. Okay. I haven't seen Caché yet, no, and I haven't read the book.
You should definitely read the book, by the way.
Yeah, I definitely will.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thanks a lot for your time, Ely. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you, Joy.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.